So my brain is in overdrive, and I just, I can't stop thinking. And I wonder, whether you ever get this idea, where you just can't stop thinking. I don't know, have you ever tried not to think? If you have tried not to think, then, most probably you realize that it's actually quite difficult not to think. Our brains are wired to think, and we fall into thoughts, in a way, because you can't stop thinking, so you fall into thoughts. As a matter of fact, the biological brain is wired to create thoughts all the time. So, in a way, we fall into thoughts continuously. And it sort of makes sense in terms of energy efficiency, because things in nature fall. Everything tends to fall. Everything falls. So, also when you look at things at a deeper level, kind of in nature you realize, all the way from sort of quarks, all the way to human beings, I think that there's this process of energy minimization and the process of falling that appears at every level. It doesn't really build up to, but it falls into. And we have literally, in a way, fallen into human beings. So, neuroscience reveals that 99% of our mind is made out of subconscious mind, and our behavior is guided by our subconscious mind. Whereas only about 1% of our behavior is guided by our conscious mind. And if we are conscious, or if we're not conscious of our subconscious, but it is the subconscious that kind of guides our behavior, then we fall into these behaviors. And as a matter of fact, I believe that we also fall into cultures, these social systems. We don't actually build cultures, but we fall into cultures. We don't build traditions, we fall into traditions. That again, as ourselves, as human beings, within ourselves, our own behaviors. So we don't build behaviors, we actually fall into these behaviors. So if a conscious mind was an iceberg, this is what it would look like. The visible part over there, it's the conscious mind, whether you have this massive part of the subconscious mind sitting below. And if our conscious mind was presented as a roulette wheel, this is what it would look like. So we have a massive pie of a subconscious mind, which makes 99%, and a very small, tiny pie of the conscious mind. So if I asked you to place a behavioral bet, to put money, throw the ball, where would you put your money in? So, consciousness and subconscious, they're both sort of important parts of our mind, and they are quite different to one another. So both are necessary for you to be fully functional. But both are specialized in their capabilities, as well as in the way they process life's experiences. So, whereas conscious mind can only process about 40 bits a second and about 1 to 3 events at the same time, the subconscious mind, on the other hand, processes thousands of different events and processes about 40 million bits per second. So you can begin to realize the difference between and the power of subconscious mind that has over our conscious mind. In terms of the memory, for example, the conscious mind the subconscious mind is responsible for our beliefs, our habits, our instincts, the memory and emotions, whereas the conscious mind It's about future vision and logical thinking. And because of the immense power of the subconscious, we sort of fall into this code of this structure that is built within us, within sort of subconscious structure. We are dragged into it. And we remain very briefly conscious during the day. Most of our time we actually spend subconsciously sort of living, moving around. And do you find yourself daydreaming sometimes? Do you catch yourself doing that? Well, that's, your subconscious kind of kicking in and, taking over. So the fact is that as adults, we do spend most of our lives subconsciously reacting to life rather than consciously creating it. We fall into these states of minds and behaviors. And it makes sense that we fall because, as stated previously, falling is energy efficient, whereas building into is not. So, based on this, intelligence is also an outcome of this mechanism of falling. And you see these falling mechanisms all over in nature, from very finite elements to all the way to human beings and beyond. And to illustrate kind of, very simply, this is a bubble. And have you ever wondered why a bubble is a sphere? You kind of have this liquid, you mix it up, you blow, and a shape of a sphere emerges. So it falls into the shape of the sphere. And the reason why it falls is that the sphere is a perfect shape to minimize the surface in relation to the internal pressures. So it's a process of energy minimization. And when one bubble meets another bubble, they share a wall. And you see this sort of structure that emerges as a result of energy minimization process. So energy efficiency. They just fall into each other and they create these structures. And you see that if you dissect the bird's bone, that's what you see internally. And doesn't this remind you of the foam structure? And again, it's that process of energy minimization where you use very little material to create that bone, but because they're non-linearly related to one another, they create a very strong structure with a lot of space in between, which creates it a strong and light structure, which makes the bird's job very easy to fly because it needs to be light. The cells in human bodies, they kind of reveal the same structure. So you can see these sort of relationships between non-living systems and the living systems. The same sort of mechanisms, they appear over and over again. And you have these sort of atoms in nature, when they bond together, they fall into molecules. And you have molecules falling into cells. You have cells falling into organs, and organs falling into bodies, and bodies falling into beings, and so on. So you have this sort of continuous process of falling into different shapes and forms, and ultimately we actually fall into cities, we fall into nations, we ultimately fall into human beings as a process of energy minimization. So structures are created as a result of this process of energy minimization. And our senses, for example, they are guided, as we said previously, by our subconscious mind. So our touching, feeling, hearing, seeing, they are all controlled by our subconscious mind. And we kind of inhibit the environments through our senses. Like, I'm inhibiting you now through my senses, and you're doing the same with me. Environments shape our minds, because our minds are not internal to us. Our brains are, but not our minds. Our minds are an emergent outcome of the brains and the environment. So they create our minds. So we are intertwined. We make one another. And the reason why we fail to acknowledge this most of the time is that, well, we're conscious only about 1%, and this is all happening, the interaction at a subconscious level. So we neglect this interaction. We fail to recognize it. We fail to recognize the importance of the environments that we create. We fail to recognize that they are continuously impacting our minds. And this brings me to the point of, the environments that we are creating today. How are we designing today? For example, what are the parameters that we're taking into consideration for building or creating environments like that? What are the parameters for creating environments like that? Are we building and designing our environments with this knowledge, taking into account these parameters that our mind is a byproduct of the environment in our brain? Are we taking into consideration that our environments are mind-changing, mind-altering substances? I think these are all, questions that we need to ask ourselves, about these parameters. What are we doing? Because the environments that we're creating have a direct impact, not only our mind, but our children's mind, of our futures. So we have a huge responsibility. We have a massive responsibility. And we need to recognize the power of this subconscious that is generating environments for us, in a way. So state laws, and these building laws and planning laws and natural habitats, and the subconscious mind and a conscious mind, these are all parameters that create this sort of filtering systems, that create these invisible boundaries through which our environments emerge. And it all starts with a thought. It all starts with an idea which has to be filtered through these systems, and there come our environments. And remember that we fall into thoughts. This system sort of gives rise to or falls into consciousness of our cities. So our cities are representation of our social mind. So us together, we create our cities, and they are representation of where we are in terms of sort of social aspect. And I often hear people, reminiscing about the past. They ask me, what do I think? Why buildings of the past, they appear to kind of have more character. They appear to sort of belong in the places where they were built in. They appear to have more soul. And today, we have these buildings that we're creating. We have these sort of environments that we're creating that just feel alien. They don't feel like they belong there. They have no connection. When you look at what is happening today here, it's almost impossible to believe that the top photograph, that environment, and the bottom one, they are not in the same city. They look quite similar. They're actually not in the same country. They're not even in the same continent. That's Albania, this is India. And the third photograph there, a friend of mine looked at it and said, oh yeah, I know that building is in Pristina. It's actually in Chad, in Africa. That one. So what's going on? What's happening? What is happening today? Were we smarter, more intelligent 100 years ago? And what has happened to our smartness or intelligence? Well, I don't think, we were smarter, more intelligent, but I think that, 100 years ago, you had a different sort of system working. 100 years ago, You couldn't travel as fast as you can travel today. 100 years ago, you had no information. Today, you can go on the internet and find out about anything you want. 100 years ago, you actually relied on the know-how of your father or your grandfather, and you were you lived there with your local cultures and local traditions and local materials which you found locally. And these parameters, these became the parameters. These became the filtering systems through which buildings emerged. So the architectural styles emerged, which by default, so the intelligence emerged as a result of actually non-ability. So you couldn't do anything else, you had to do this, and because you had to do this, you fell into that. And so these sort of styles today, they are seen as bold, they're seen as unique, seen as sort of they define the places where they come from. Unlike the ones that we see here, which they sort of seem to fade on the global eyes of what I can call sameness. You can see here that because of our ability to get access to information, we have information overload. There's so much information, and we have ability to actually buy cheap products from places like China and to bring them over here, and it costs cheaper to buy from there than maybe to build from with local materials, and it is sort of easier to build maybe with this sort of materials than to actually use anything locally. So you can see that it's this process of energy minimization. We try and find the easy way to do things. And unfortunately, it feels that we're falling into this trap of doing things easy, and actually we get totally detached to the roots. We're sort of creating these superficial environments that are impacting our mind negatively, because we're failing to acknowledge that architecture and built environments are not 3D buildings that you copy and paste and you build something. They actually have an impact on our mind. So they are extremely important. And we get information from internet and we try and build something, and someone builds something which is not great. And then the other ones copies it because it's easy to copy, and that's what happens. Well, that has gone through a similar process, but it has taken about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to filter into that. Whereas this is happening so fast because of the vast amount of the information that we have that we're killing ourselves. So today it has become more important to know what not to do, to be selective, than what to do. We owe it to us, to ourselves, to our children, to our futures, to start engaging with the deep roots. With deep roots, with our own consciousness, understand our own subconscious behavior and the impact that it has, and knowledge that it guides us. And also to understand that our cities are representation of our social consciousness. So if we fall into these thoughts, and if we fall into thinking, then we need to design for falling. But we need to recognize the power of falling throughout all these levels within ourselves and our societies. We need to ask questions like, have we consciously impacted our subconscious to fall into happy and positive states of mind? Have we consciously shaped our family life to subconsciously fall into a happy and healthy family? Have we consciously shaped our homes to subconsciously fall into these happy feelings? Have we consciously shaped our streets and communities to fall into healthy and positive communities? Are we consciously shaping our cities to help us fall into happy and healthy citizens? And are we consciously shaping our cities so that they are these beautiful and bold, and they stand out in this global cloud of sameness? And remember that we fall into thoughts, that we are guided by our subconscious behavior, by our subconscious mind, which controls our behavior, of which we are very little aware of, and that it is energy efficient to fall. And everything in nature falls into shapes, forms, and structures. And if we continuously fall, we need to design for falling. Instead of pushing against this massive power of subconscious mind, we need to consciously start understanding it, interacting with it, and turning it towards a position that it actually pushes us forward toward a state of a happy and blissful life. So we can set ourselves free to fall into blissful uncertainty. Thank you.